Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We'll be starting in a few minutes. Just give us a little break, but we'll be with you shortly. Hello, and welcome to this joint meeting of Barbados Museum's Genealogy and History groups. This is our first session for 2021. I trust that you are all staying safe within the present COVID-19 environment. And again, thank you all for taking the time to join with us this evening. My name is Harriet Pierce, and I am the coordinator for the genealogy group, a group that has been in existence since March of 2014. So this is actually our anniversary month. Today, let's welcome James Webster, who will be speaking to us from British Columbia on the topic, Discovering My Roots Through Old Barbados Maps. Born in Canada, Jim first visited Barbados in 1967 before relocating here in 1969 to take up a job at Sea Welfare Services. Living and working here until 1971, Jim discovered that his family roots were quite extensive. While doing his family research, he was introduced to Tony Campbell's article, the printed maps of Barbados from the earliest times to 1873, which helped to trigger an interest in historical maps, map making, and in particular, the maps of Barbados. This culminated in the publishing of the article, The Printed Maps of Barbados, 1500 to 1900, on BeijingThings.com in February of 2020. During this presentation, Jim will look at the development of Barbados' maps over the centuries, their progression, and their stories, as well as how they can be used in genealogy and family research. In combination with archival records, Facebook, and modern publications, Jim will also examine how he was able to piece together his family history from the earliest days of English settlement on the island. We look forward to hearing this. But before Jim takes over, just a little housekeeping. Please hold your questions until the end of Jim's presentation. At that point, you can either type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will allow you to speak. If you have any other comments or greetings, please enter those in the chat, which is also at the bottom of the screen. Jim, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Harriet. I will, it's a real honor to be here today and to present. This is my first presentation via Zoom, so if we go back and forth a couple of times, you'll have to bear with me. But we've run through it a couple of times and I think we're all set. I'll just share my screen now and then we can get rolling. That's interesting. Okay, let's see. Are you able to see my screen properly there? Are we seeing the slideshow now? Just nod up and down, Harriet. Are you able to hear me? Okay.
Sorry, yes, I could hear you quite well.
Okay, and you're just seeing the slideshow on the screen.
No, I'm not seeing the slides at the moment.
Oh, okay.
I was seeing them before, but the notes were also included.
Yeah. See, we only went through this about share screen. Okay, here we go. All right, I think we're good. We're good now?
Yes, we're in business.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome everybody. It's great to have so many people online interested in this subject. When I was putting this together, I realized that if I just focused on slides, we'd be into of maps, we'd be into 2 or 3 hours. And if I just focused on genealogy, we might be into 2 or 3 hours. So trying to combine the two, I've tried to be concise as possible. And we're not going to see every map of Barbados, but what I've tried to do is pick out ones that I feel best tell the story. And the story I want to try to tell today is a little bit about how I've used Barbados maps and other information to build a better understanding of my family's history. I first came to Barbados. I wasn't born in Barbados, but my dad was, and all his family going back to the 1600s. So I first came to Barbados when I was about 17, and not knowing much about my family or not knowing much about the country. And when I got there, we stayed on the south coast, a place down on Maxwell Coast Road. And one of the places that I wandered to during that time was down the end of Maxwell Coast Road. There was an old cemetery. And under my wing, while I was there, I started to meet relatives that I didn't know I had. And one in particular, Colin Webster, who's deeply involved with the history of Barbados and quite interested, took me under his wing and took me around the island. And he told me about this old cemetery and how there'd once been a church there and it had got washed out to sea. During that trip, I heard different pieces of the family background. I had learned that my dad had been born at Sturgis Plantation, and we drove by Sturgis with the big radio tower. I'd learned that my grandfather had been born in Penny Hole, and that before he had died, he had lived at Ferry Valley as a plantation. When I got there, my grandfather had already been dead 20 years, and so I never did get to meet him, but I did hear lots of stories about him. So during that visit, it was, I was 17, so I was more interested in going to the beach and meeting people, but there was always stories being told about about family history, and some of it I took in, and a lot of it I didn't. As I started to learn about family history and trying to understand and utilize the maps in building the story, one of the things that always had confounded me was the fact that Columbus had sailed to the New World in 1492, and yet the first British settlement on Barbados was 1625. And somewhere in my brain, I couldn't fathom how could people have sailed by Barbados so many times and didn't know it was there and nobody had settled it. What I realized was that that was a bit of a mistake, and that in fact that Barbados had been known from almost by the 1500s. When the time Columbus set out to discover, on his voyage of discovery, to go east, he had the world, the understanding of the world was actually quite advanced. That they had known from Greek times, or they had assumed from Greek times, that the world was actually round, and the idea that the world was flat, that some of us learned in school, I think came out of a book in the 1800s when it was talking about Columbus and saying the world was flat. But they actually understood that the world was round. So Columbus, by this, just a couple of years before Columbus, around 1498, Diaz had sailed around the Cape Horn, and they now knew you could navigate around Africa. So this map came out around 1490, which was probably one of the maps that Columbus had referred to. And when he looked at it, even though they knew there was an idea of how round the world was or what their circumference was, maybe looking at this map, he felt that he could head east, and or if he headed west, that he'd get to the east a lot quicker than trying to go around Africa. The first map, very quickly, once Columbus had done his four voyages, there was a lot of discovery, and John Cabot had gone up to Newfoundland, and there was a lot of sharing of information in Europe between the different countries, even though Spain and Portugal tried to keep their information quite secret. But the first map to actually show Barbados and actually have it named what came out in 1516. I've read somewhere that the name was there in 1511, but it actually appeared. The first map that I found it on was this map of 1516. If you actually Google how Barbados got its name, a lot of reference, and this shows how things get repeated, puts it to a Portuguese sailor and said that he had landed in Barbados in 1536, but it was obvious that the name of the island was known and being used before that. One of the reasons that the British and probably the French hadn't started to colonize islands earlier was there was an agreement that was set out between the Portuguese and the French, and with the help of the Pope, and they had split the world. And there was a line that came down through the Canary Islands and down through Brazil, and it was adjusted once. Oops. And basically giving Portugal the right to colonize the lands on the east side, and Spain to have ownership to the lands on the west side. Portugal used their I guess their grant to be able to develop their colony in Brazil, and bringing slaves over from Africa to Brazil, where the Spanish were more interested in gold and silver and weren't too big into farming and agriculture, and proceeded over the next 20 years to start to take the native population from the islands and use those as slaves and in their mines in South America. Barbados, the first settlement in Barbados was in 1627 under a Dutchman quarantine, and a ship by William Powell had landed near present-day Holetown. This is the very first map of Barbados, and it was that still survives, and it was done by John Hapcock, and it shows the plantation, which was the Fort Plantation, which is just near where St. James Church is on the west coast. And this map came about, and there was probably a lot of other maps developed around that same period of similar type maps. When the first colonists came to Barbados, they were mainly coming out of England, and they were given small parcels of land, 5 acres, 10 acres of land, and it was going to be more of an agricultural-based economy. By the time this map was done in the 1640s, a lot of those small plantations were being consolidated because sugar had been introduced to the island, and that required bigger estates and a bigger labor force. So very quickly in those first 20 years, Barbados started to change from these small 2 to 5 acre plots into much bigger estates. And this map here actually shows that the land that was under agriculture at that time, and then plus land that was going to be further cleared. There was a study done on the Fort Plantation, which later became known as Trent's, and right in about here, there was excavations done in the 1990s and 80s that because it was one of the very few slave villages that had not been plowed over in the last 400 years. It was actually on a hill. It's on quite a steep slope in here, and so it had remained untouched. And then there was a paper published by Armstrong and Riley talking about their work that they had done on that site. The very first complete map of Barbados was the Richard Lingan map, which was published in 1657. He was an Englishman that had got caught up in the English Civil War and was a royalist supporter and had come out to, lost a lot of what he had in England and came to Barbados in 1647 and stayed to 1650. When he arrived, there was a epidemic going on, very similar to, I guess, what we have today, only that was probably yellow fever at that time. And there was a lot of sickness and people were dying. And he ended up staying on an estate. And he was very, quite attentive to detail. He wrote a lot about the flowers, the plants, and things that were discovered on Barbados at that time, or that were on Barbados at that time. He wrote in his book that he actually didn't have time to survey the island. And so this map was probably, even though he may have drawn it, was not surveyed by him. He talks about meeting the island surveyor, John Swan, and Swan by 1640 had produced a map of Barbados, probably very much like this one. But the governor at that time, Henry Hunks, had taken the map and sent it off to England. So by the time Lingan showed up in 1647, there wasn't really a map of Barbados on the island. And so when he met with Swan, Swan pulled out all his old papers and notes, and they were able to reconstruct the map based on that information. There's been some question over the years as to whether or not all the names on the map there, and there was about 230 plantations shown on here, even though there was well over 700 or 800 on the island at that time. So they weren't all shown. The question was this information that Richard had gathered, or was it information from Swan? From what I can see, looking at the list of plantation owners in Barbados in 1638, there was a list of 750 people that owned 10 or more acres. A good percentage of the 200 and plus landowners on this map were on that list, whereas when you go to the Ford map of 1675, there's only 5 or 6 of the names that are still on that map. So I think obviously that this map is probably more the information that was collected by Swan and changed very slightly. You can see the location of the Hapcott map that was drawn. And it's interesting because the landowners at that place, where there's 2 Powells that are listed, and there's also a fort, which is maybe how it got its original name. And the 2 Powells were the 2 brothers that had come and settled in Barbados with the first colonists. Another point of interest on this map is when I'd stayed on Maxwell Coast Road, that little graveyard, the cemetery where the church had been washed out to sea, is actually shown on this map down on the south coast. And it's the only map of Barbados where Christ Church is actually shown on the coast because it was washed away out to sea in the 1670s in a flood. And all subsequent maps have it up on the hill just above Oistins. Another interesting thing on this map is it shows a little island here off the south coast. And this has kind of been a point of a lot of discussions on various Facebook pages. There's Pelican Island used to be here, just where this boat is. But on this first map, the only island was actually shown on the south coast. And an island on the south coast actually appears on subsequent maps. Now, whether they were from different surveys or they were just copied, the same mistake was copied over and over again. But you can see all the other maps that this little island subsequently appears on. And my thinking is, looking at the map and doing some georeferencing, is that the little island actually is referring to the reef off of where Sandy Beach is, and that possibly at that time the sea was lower, or that was more prominent, and it actually got mapped and was included as a small island. Now, as far as our Webster family goes, and how I started to use the maps to sort of piece this story together, I guess in some ways I was luckier than a lot of people who were building their family trees. A lot of the work, when I started getting interested in genealogy, had actually been done by a couple of other people ahead of me. And Gerald Webster and George had done extensive research into family history, and actually had our family tree done back to the 1600s. What I was more interested in was taking those names and trying to build a story and figure out how did this family live on Barbados for 400 years? Like, what did they do, and what were they? And because when they first came in, they didn't come in as indentured servants, which a lot of the poorer white people came in as indentured servants. They weren't big landowners. They weren't on that list of 10 acres or more. And subsequent, until really the 20th century, a couple of them started to acquire plantations. But up to that point, they weren't big plantation owners, and they hadn't come as slaves. So I tried to figure out, what did they actually do? Something that I learned about quite recently was in Morris Greenwich's book about Holetown. He actually talks about that first ship, the William and John, that came to Barbados in 1627. And he says that it was named after two investors out of London, William Arnold and John Webster. I haven't been able to confirm where he got that information about John Webster, but I have, so that's still a mystery to be solved. But the other, William Arnold, if these two are his partner in that boat, was actually a descent, or an ancestor of the famous Arnold from the American Revolution, Benedict Arnold. The next bit of information on where a Webster appeared was in a book by Nicholas Foster, and he wrote this book in 1650. It was about the horrendous rebellion in Barbados, and John Webster appears in that book, and what it's talking about is the English Civil War, and how that had finally come to Barbados around 1649 and 1650. Up to that point, the Governor Bell had tried to keep the island fairly neutral, but Cromwell in the Civil War had shipped out a lot of defeated royalists and shipped them off to Barbados, and probably shipped so many that it reached the point where they now were vying for power on the island, and wanted to get rid of anybody with parliamentary leanings. And John Webster must have had some of those parliamentary leanings, because he had his tongue cut out and his two cheeks branded with the letter T for traitor. Another reference, in 1647, there was a record. It goes on for about 3 or 4 years, and it talks about a case that was being brought by the early adventurers to Barbados against the Earl of Carlisle. And the Earl of Carlisle had died in 1638, and he had left a lot of debts and a lot of creditors, and these early adventurers that came over to set up plantations small plantations were left destitute, and so they had brought a case in London against in the House of Lords that went on for years and years and years. So he wasn't, even though John Webster got to Barbados, he wasn't doing too well by that point. When you start looking at the archives, you'll start, and the church records, you can see that John Webster Sr. was married in the original Christ Church in 1649, and his first son was baptized at Christ Church in 1651. John Webster Sr. appears in the census of Barbados in 1679, and it showed that he actually owned 5 acres and 1 slave. So much to my chagrin, when you discovered that, is we did have a slave ownership in the history of our family. By 1703, his land was left to his sons, and it was adjoining Nargrove Plantation. Even though Webster didn't appear on the map, Nargrove did, and it's only just a short distance from that original the Christ Church. And so I was able to take that information and go through these old maps and start looking around. Well, was there something? I couldn't find any Webster on there. I couldn't find the Christ Church on this, the old Christ Church, but I did find Nargrove and figure out exactly where he had lived with those 5 acres. By 1715, he had died, but his wife Mary and their 4 children were still listed in the census. Richard Ford in 1675 did the first really detailed survey of the island. In the original map, the distances, the width and the length were wrong, but this was actually a true survey. And again, it listed a lot of the plantation owners. On most of these early maps, you'll actually see that the plantations are listed not by a plantation name, they were listed by the name of the owner. But over time, through the centuries, a lot of these plantations started to take on the names of some of those early plantation owners. Like Wildy Plantation was actually from the 1700s, was a John Wildy, and it eventually became Wildy Plantation and then Wildy Industrial Park. So as I started to go through the maps, I could add Whole Town up here where the first settlers came in. I had the little island actually shows up on this map, and then plus down here where in Christ Church where John Webster was living. This map was actually quite interesting for the detail. It actually showed how quickly sugar, even though it had just come in 1640, by 1675, we had gone from this very forested island to one that was basically stripped of all forest and was all under sugar agriculture. To crush the sugar and to make sugar, crush the sugar cane and make sugar, they had windmills, and that technology had been brought in again from the Portuguese colonies in Brazil by Jewish people that knew how to build windmills, and they were actually had left Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, then gone to Portugal. And then when the Portuguese introduced the Inquisition, they'd gone to the Netherlands and learned about windmills there. And then when the Dutch and the Portuguese went into Brazil, they already had an understanding of how windmills worked and were constructed. And then that knowledge was brought to Barbados. And you can see they also had water mills and cattle mills. I would think with the number of or lack of creeks and rivers in Barbados, there weren't an awful lot of water mills on the map. William Mayo's map of 1721 is actually a very interesting map because it was very detailed, and it actually became the basis and the foundation for a lot of future maps for actually another 130, 140 years. Instead of doing a whole new survey, they would take Mayo's map and use that as the base map, and then make changes, additions, change the names of the plantations and stuff. And even in Schomburg's book in the 1640s, the William Mayo's map of 1721 was used. It actually had a couple of interesting vignettes on the map. One showing how they did the surveying at that time, and using the wheel for measuring the sighting and taking the measurements and distances to build this very detailed map. It's also the very first map to actually, even though there had been 11 parishes from the the late 1600s, it was the first one to really define the parish boundaries, and those parish boundaries remained intact up to this present day. Thomas Jefferson's map did a lot of work mapping in North America, or did the cartography and design the drafting of maps done by other surveyors in North America. But one of the maps that he did was this map, again, based on Mayo's map of 1721. He did this map for King George, who was an avid map collector. And this was done in 1771. And it's interesting to see the Quakers seem to be big into map making, because a number of the people who were map makers in Barbados were Quakers, and they each had some of the maps were done for different purposes, keeping track of what plantations, who the plantations owners were, for taxation. There was other maps that were done for defenses that showed the forts and the churches. But this map here, he's managed to put in the Quaker meeting houses. Francis Barrière was a Frenchman from Toulon. His family lived in Toulon, and at the time of the French Revolution, they were royalists in France, and they left and went to London. At that point, when he got older, he joined the English army and was sent to Australia, and actually went to Australia and lived there for 3 or 4 years in working in New South Wales, mapping a large part of the Blue Mountains in Australia. He had a falling out with his commander and returned to London about 1799, and subsequently ended up coming back to Barbados, or to the West Indies, to help design defenses for St. Vincent, because the French and English at this time were always going back. It was around the time of Napoleon, so there was always skirmishes going on. And so he was in St. Vincent, and then was there when the English attacked Martinique. But he finally came back and settled in Barbados, and was put to work doing a very detailed survey of the island. This is one of my favorite maps, and it's a map that is used and referenced an awful lot, because it not only listed or had plantations marked on the map, it actually listed them and listed the names of the plantations, but also listed the names of the plantation owners. One of the other things that he did when he was in Barbados, he was given the job of actually erecting the new statue to Lord Nelson and built the base and unveiled that. So it's kind of ironic in a way that now Nelson has now been removed, and yet his map remains, and is now the map that is used because of the detail on the site, the legacies of British slave ownership, which is actually a very interesting site because it really gives us a much clearer understanding of the impact of slavery in a real sense on the whole British Caribbean. If you go to that site, all these little dots, if you actually click on them, you can click on, it'll pull up that plantation. It'll tell you who the owner of the plantation was, how many slaves they had. It'll give a record going back when they started to do the slave registers of 1813. It'll show you how many slaves were there and what compensation the slave owner received. This was a part of the negotiating that went on to try and get slavery ended. Is the plantation owners, the slave owners wanted compensation, and now here we are, almost 200 years later, and this is a big topic in the news nowadays, and is whether or not how does some of that money get repatriated back from the people that received it in the first place and back to the actual slave descendants and the colonies. Now, as far as our family goes, going back, when I got up, there was sort of a period there from the early 1700s where I was able to find some information on the Websters. They were on the family tree, but in the 1800s, they kind of popped up again. There was a period there when the church records, they would actually list who the father was, who the mother was, the date of birth, but it wouldn't give you any details on where they actually lived and what they did. And when I got to Joseph Henry Webster here, 1627, I went to the archives with a cousin of mine, and who has done a lot of research there. And I said, Freddie, I'd like to go to the archives. And we went down there, and I said, and he knew the people. And I was actually sitting there going through these books, not knowing what I was looking for. And I started going through a book of wills, and I found this will listed for Joseph Henry Webster. And I'm looking at this, and so he said to me, he says, yeah, he says, they can go get it for you. And I said, what? And so they went in the back and pulled out the original will for Joseph Henry Webster. And he was in our family tree. And in the will, he had about 15 children. I think about 12 of them were actually listed in the will. And it showed that he had a house, a cow, and I think maybe a horse or something. There wasn't much in the will, and this was going to be divided amongst these 12 children and his wife. So this really got me going about 5-6 years ago. And that's when I started to go onto the genealogy sites and started to really get introduced to these maps, because he was listed as a resident of Diamond in St. Philip. So I posted on one of the sites asking where this little diamond was, because I couldn't find it anywhere, and I couldn't find any reference to it. And Carl Watson came on and said, yeah, I think that's in St. Philip. And he said, if you really want to know about this, you should go. There was a book published by Tony Campbell in 1965, listing a lot of the early maps of Barbados. So I went tracking or looking around and was able to get a copy of this book through eBay out of a place in England, and started to do some Googling and trying to figure out who Tony Campbell was, and wondering if he was even around, and because the book had been published in 1965, and amazingly, I found Tony, and I think he may be here with us on the talk today, which is a real honor for me. Anyway, from there I started digging around and started finding all these maps, and we put them up on Bajan's things so people can actually go there and zoom in and get the detailed version. But they've been a huge help in then piecing this story together, because after that trip to the archives, then I was able to go on Family Search and start finding more about Joseph Henry Webster, because every time one of his 15 children was born, it would say where he lived, what his career was, what he was doing. So we've been born in 1827 at Mount Pleasant plantation. His father was a shoemaker living in the tenantry there. He subsequently became a shopkeeper in parish land, and Ogerson's here. And then when he got married and the kids got baptized, it was all at St. Philip's Church. And then subsequently, he must have done well enough as a shopkeeper that he was able to raise some money to buy this 20 acres at Little Diamond, which is where he died. So the story started to having these maps and having access to these Facebook pages and to these genealogy sites. What had just been sort of a family tree actually for me started to come together, and I could actually really start to visualize where the family had lived and what they had done. From that very first visit in 1967, I remembered Penny Hole, and I was able to go back and found a map by Richard Bloom from 1670, which actually listed Penny Hole on it. When I was down in Barbados at that time and over the subsequent trips, I'd heard that we were related to the Ward family, but I never really met any Wards in any of the time that I was down there. So I didn't quite understand how we were related to the Wards. And it wasn't until I started to really dig into the last few years, I learned that my grandfather's mother was an Alice Ward, and that she had come from Penny Hole. And when I started digging around a bit more, this is where my grandfather was born. He'd been born at Penny Hole and baptized at St. Martin's Chapel in St. Philip. And that Alice Ward, her father was Richard Ward, had actually been another shoemaker. It was like there was a lot of shoemakers in Barbados and in our family, and he had lived in Foul Bay. And subsequently, he had done well as a shoemaker and managed to buy 10 acres at Penny Hole, which is probably where my great-grandfather and my grandfather and Alice met. And so it started to piece together. I'm sure a few of you are familiar with the Ward name. Alice was the sister of Aubrey Ward and Edmund Ward, who Aubrey was the one that really was on all the bottles of Mount Gay rum and had quite an extensive family in Barbados over the years, and now there's a lot of Wards in Barbados, and many of whom that we're related to. And I've just actually, after even all this time, I've only started to really connect and make some connections with that Ward side of the family. Aubrey Ward and his brother Edmund, even though they come from a small humble beginnings in Penny Hole, turned out to be very astute businessmen. And when at the end of the 1800s, a lot of the plantations were going into bankruptcy, they borrowed money and started buying plantations out of Chancery. And subsequently, by the time my grandfather and his brothers came along and were being raised in Penny Hole, their uncles, Aubrey and Edmund Ward, started to own these plantations, and they were looking for family members to operate the plantations. So my grandfather and his brothers, a lot of them actually, their first jobs were working on Ward plantations. And my grandfather had actually went to Antigua to work on a plantation that Edmund Ward had bought there. So this is one of my favorite maps, and it's probably the last map that I've actually Googled, because when I came across this map, I just said, like, what is this? It's kind of got Barbados, and then it's got Barbados in reverse, and kind of backwards overlaid on it. And what I discovered was, and you can see it down here in this little note, it was actually what one of the pigments that they'd used in making the map, and this map had been printed in a book. When the book was closed, the green pigment, acetate, made this duplicate image of Barbados on the map. And so what I've tried to do on this map, and I mean, it's pretty busy, is actually just show the different places over these last 400 years where our family appeared, you know, starting up here in Holetown, and then down in Christchurch, and then St. Philip's, and then from St. Philip down to Penny Hole and Foul Bay, and then my dad being born up in Sturgis, and then finally my grandfather working at Ferry Valley just before he died. And it was at Ferry Valley, I think a few years ago. I think when I wanted to touch on Barbados is probably a little different than a lot of countries in the world, and maybe in some ways we're the same too. Is a few years ago I went to a funeral in Barbados, probably 12, 14 years ago. And when I was at that funeral, a cousin of mine, a second cousin, like everybody in Barbados has got cousins, and layers of cousins, said to me, I'd like you to meet a cousin of yours who I hadn't met before. And when I got introduced to this cousin, I looked at him and I said, you know, he was really happy to meet me. And he says, oh, you're Jim Webster. Your grandfather was also Jim. He says, I know all about you. And, but I knew nothing about him. And he said, you know, if you wait at the funeral here, when your aunt is going to be coming to the funeral. And I said, my aunt? I said, my aunt's all passed away. He said, no. And he says, you've actually got an aunt coming to the funeral as well. And so I see this lady coming. Anyway, I discovered at that funeral and meeting my aunt, my grandfather had a much bigger family than I was aware of. And, but through that meeting, my whole understanding of my family has grown so much. And I now have a much bigger family than I knew I had. Anyway, I won't go. I think I think it's interesting when you're doing genealogy that you will actually, if you put yourself out there, you'll discover things that you probably didn't know about yourself and you didn't know about your family. But a lot of times when I'm on these sites, people will be talking about how they did a DNA test and they tried to reach out to somebody and who had the same DNA, but they didn't respond. And I guess my take is our families are bigger than just families we know, and we all want to learn more about ourselves and where we came from. So if people reach out to you, I would say take that opportunity to reach out because you might really grow as a person and as an individual. Anyway, this is all the different things that I've used over the years trying to piece this family story together. And for me, it's been an amazing journey. So I want to thank everybody who's helped in building that journey and that story for me. And thank you all for joining in and coming today and listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was a very interesting presentation. I think we all have come away with a better understanding of maps and how to read some of those maps, because maps for some of us are, in a different category, and we may not understand some of the graphics on the maps. But thank you for going through that. Also demonstrated how these maps allow you to expand your family history from not just names and dates, but to add context and depth by looking, finding what they did, learning more about your ancestors in order to build that narrative. We will now open for questions. So we've asked persons to either type their questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen or raise your hand and we will allow you to ask your question live. Okay. We have a raised hand. And I saw a raised hand before, but I'm not seeing it now. But we actually have a question from our Facebook page, our Facebook feed. We're actually going live on Facebook as well. And this is a question from Christine. I'm not sure how to pronounce her surname, Stoehr of New Jersey, where she's looking for her seventh great grandmother, Jane Ward, who lived between 1673 and 1743. Did that name come up in your research, Jim?
No, but there's a Facebook page now dedicated to the Ward family that's run by, I hope Jenny does, Aline. And so if you go on Facebook, you can actually get connected to the Ward family. And she has a very extensive Ward family tree that goes back to 1635. It connects the two brothers that came together on the same boat, the Wards. So even though the Wards, you always hear the name Ward, there's actually two branches of the Ward family on Barbados.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Christine. We also have someone who is asking about surviving relatives of the Archers. This may just be a general question, not necessary for you, Jim. There are Archers living in Barbados. In fact, I have Archer in my family tree. Yes. We have way back Mary Archer, who would be my several great-grandmother. This is an Archer from St. Lucie. So yes, there are several Archer families in Barbados. So this person is an anonymous attendee. Perhaps you may want to, if you know the ancestors, you may want to put an ad in one of the daily newspapers, checking on your branch of the family. So thank you for your question.
We have a question from Mr. Simon Krendler. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question? You have been unmuted.
This is not a question. It's just a curiosity for me. I grew up on Maxwell's Coast Road, actually 2 houses away from that cemetery. And when I was a very young kid, my sister and I used to go and walk through that cemetery and read those stones, the inscriptions on those stones. And I only recently found out that there had been a church there at one point, but of course it was gone by the time, I was there in the 1940s. Anyway, just interesting curiosity and lovely to hear a reference to it.
Yes, that church was actually destroyed around the 1660s by flooding, heavy rains and flooding.
Right. Thank you very much. A wonderful presentation.
Thank you. And if you go back, there's still some of those gravestones still there. There's a Mr. Curtin. That one is still there. Every time I go back to Barbados, I go and wander through it again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Any other questions? Or we have some here in Q&A. Let me just check. Oh, someone wants to know, Jim, John Knox, if you found any Quakers in your early family history.
No, I didn't find any Quakers in the family history, but my grandfather actually, a lot of the church records that are indexed on Family Search were the Anglican church records, but there are Moravian and there are other church records that haven't been indexed yet, that have been copied. My grandfather, when he got married, his wife was not Anglican, and so he actually changed denominations. And because of that, when my father was born, he wasn't baptized in an Anglican church, so he didn't show up in those church records. So, but no, I didn't have any Quakers that I've found so far.
Thanks, Jim. We have another question for you. Someone wants to know, where did you find the maps for your research?
Well, a lot of them were in Tony Campbell's book. Alan Moss had then subsequently written more about those maps and some other maps in the journal, the Barbados Museum Journal, and E.M. Shilstone had written, who the library is named after, had done an initial story about the maps. So what I did was I took those books and I started going onto Google, and I soon started to find there was a John Carter Brown University, there was the British Library, there was the Library of Congress. A lot of these institutions actually have originals of these old maps that they've digitized, and if you go to the site, those sites, you can actually zoom right in on these maps and see the fine detail. So what I did was, when we published the update on Bajan things, which rather than publishing it in a book, by having it on the internet, you could embed these links. So by going to having on Bajan things, we put a snapshot of the map, but then wherever possible, wherever we found it, we put a link so you can actually go to get the high resolution. And I think right now we're up over 70 some maps on that site, all old Barbados maps. There's a map, an Admiralty map from 1859, which was one of my favorites, done by a fellow named, it was done for the British Admiralty by a fellow named Taylor, and again, using that Mayo map as the base, but it's on the British Library site, but they were using Adobe Flash, and it hasn't been updated, so I can't access that map anymore, which just drives me crazy, so because I can't go and zoom in and see all my favorite spots. So hopefully they'll get that updated. Maybe this will get to their attention. They need to update their site.
Thank you, Jim. We have another one here. This is from Mohammed A.K. Patel, who wants to know where we'll find diamond today. He thinks it's close to Ebenezer Village, Brereton, or Carrington's land.
He's asking me. I mean, he knows Barbados. He knows Barbados way better than I do. In fact, when I come back, I'm getting in his car and we're going to go exploring. But I'm not. I'm not exactly sure where that is. But I'll communicate with him. I'll get a bit more details and maybe we can find it.
Perhaps this is a point where I can put a plug for one of the books we have in our shop, which was published by the museum, called Of Halls, Hills, and Holes, Place Names of Barbados. So any of these places, some of them that may no longer be on the map, you can just have a look at that book. It gives you some idea of its location.
I think that book is essential when you're working with these maps. Every time I pull out a map, I go to that book and I'll look and see if it's in there, and it's amazing the detail in that book and the research that was done putting that together, because it always says, okay, it was adjacent to this plantation or that plantation, the name changed, and then from there I can go and find the particular map, because the names of these plantations changed over time. So sometimes you might hear the name of a place, and if you go to that book, you'll be able to just see how it may have changed. I think one thing that I've discovered is because of the background in Barbados and the history of we had the plantation owners, and then through slavery, not everybody is able to access the data that I was able to access through the church records. And so it becomes very much more difficult and frustrating to trace your family tree. And I think that's where you really have to look at those family stories and get an idea of because really up until the 70s, most of those plantation names exist. So if you can actually get some names of a location, then you can go back and start looking at these maps and start to pinpoint, okay, this is where my family was from, and then from there help you build your family history and your family story.
Thanks, Jim. We have a question from Anne Emery, who was asking, are there lists of people who arrived in Barbados by ship? Jim, you want to go first?
Yes, there are some. You can find some of those records online on some of the ships. There's actually quite extensive passenger lists, I think, on Ancestry and stuff. Maybe somebody else knows a little bit more about that, but I've been able to access some, but certainly not all of them.
Okay, thanks, Jim. What I can add to that, for persons who arrive here, say between 1600 and 1700, there's a book called Houghton's Original List, which you can actually download online, free. And there's also the omitted chapters of Houghton. That book actually gives you the port of embarkation, the name of the ship, the captain, the persons on the ship, and their destination. Because they not only came to Barbados, but some went to Virginia and other parts of the American continent. So that is something else that you can check. Of course, if you're looking at ships that came here with the enslaved, Altis work on the ships database, that may be of assistance as well.
there's a thesis by a Peter Colby, and it was one of the that I referred to, and I think he completed his thesis in 2017. And you can actually, if you Google Peter J. Colby, Koby, he did extensive research on the migration of indentured servants from Bristol and other ports. Plus, he actually did a lot of work comparing, overlapping the early Barbados maps, georeferencing, and you can see how the different mappers located different plantations, but also he tied them into the census records from and showed how the maps related to the census. So it's really, if you're interested in this, it's actually a very excellent document. And that was the one, as much as I Googled his name, I could never actually track him down and find out where he was, because I would have loved to have talked to him. Oh, I think you're muted, Harriet.
Sorry about that. Yes, just a final addition to that point. The Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society has, over the years, a number of lists of persons who would have come out as indentured servants, their names, their bond masters, and so on. So that is another source for that type of information. We have another question from Ed Heller. He asks you, Jim, do you know of a survey map containing a detailed drawing of St. Anne's Garrison? I am interested in an area known as Schmidt's Gate.
Not a really detailed map of St. Anne's Garrison, no. Now, that being said, that's actually a very good question, because as that's where the British regiment would have been, I'm sure there probably was a map of St. Anne's, and I'm going to make a note of that to see what we can find. Because when they built all the tunnels under the garrison, and if you haven't been there, if you go to George Washington House, you can actually access this network of amazingly built drainage tunnels that were built under the whole garrison. But I think when they built those tunnels, they must have had a map made of that area. So I think that's something to look into.
What I can tell Mr. Heller is that there's a book that looks at the garrison historic buildings, and there's actually a plan, and it does show Schmidt's Gate, which is there's only a gate post remaining now. That is the area exiting onto Beckles Road. That's Beckles Road over there. Yes. So you can see the gate post is still there, and that is what was Schmidt's Gate, somewhere in that area. Okay, there's another question from Luke Corliss. Is it better to trace your family history backwards or look for the beginning and work your way forward? I have been stuck trying to work back past my great-great-grandfather, Henry Corliss. What is your experience, Jim?
I think I was lucky. Somebody else had already done most of that digging, but I think that it's probably easier if you can access records is you build on what you know. And sometimes that might be somewhere in the middle. It might be with your father or your grandfather. Because of privacy, a lot of records aren't online yet, past about 1910, 1920. And so if you can actually get somebody who was born, say 1910, and you can go online and find their record, then you can usually find out their parents if they're shown, and then from there you kind of extrapolate. Okay, they were born 20 years. They're probably 20 years old when they had their child, depending which child they were, and you can start working your way backwards and doing that. But it's not easy because a lot of these generations, like John Webster, I don't know how far back John Webster went, but we had at least 5 John Websters. And maybe when you get back to England, they went back another 5 generations of John Websters. And I once Googled John Webster in England in 1600s thinking, well, I'll tie it into England. And I mean, there were so many John Websters popped up. It was like the only name they had was John. So it can be frustrating sometimes, no doubt.
Yes, it is. But what I can tell the participant from my experience, it is always better to work backwards. So you work from a point of knowledge and work backwards, which allows you to keep the connection. And then once you go back a generation each time, you can go back, you can expand laterally, but you keep that connection. Sometimes you may come across blocks, and then you have to try various ways to try to get past those blocks using different types of records. But sometimes there's some blocks that sometimes you can never surmount, or some that take a very long time. But I think it's best to work backwards, keeping that connection. We have another question from Beth Mills, who is asking about the Seal family. She said that the Seal family lore said that there were 4 brothers and a couple of sisters who came over in the mid-1640s. I have often wondered whether the various spellings of seal, sealy, seals, and so on might be simple pronunciation variations on the surname Seal. What would be your thoughts on this idea? She asked Jim and she asked myself. So Jim, you go first.
First off, oh, there, Beth, thank you. Oh, it's not showing up. I still have your map. I have to get it in a frame. You know, that's interesting because I think because sometimes these records have been transcribed 2 or 3 times, or maybe the person who was giving the record, you know, say when John Webster didn't know how to read or write, if the person in the church that was recording the original record wasn't sure about the spelling, they might have spelt the name one way. So sometimes I think you have to actually look beyond the obvious. You know, you can look for different spellings and variations of the same name, which makes it trickier.
I agree. You cannot be married to one particular spelling. But what I also want to tell Beth is that work on the Seal family, quite extensive work was done by Burton Seal, who he lived in Australia. I think he's now in New Zealand. And he has deposited several of his books in the library here at the museum. So the next time you're in Barbados, you may wish to visit us and have a look at that research. Okay, there's someone asking if there are any maps of Barbados that show more detail of natural features, such as the mangrove swamps and so on. Have you come across any of that, Jim?
Yes, some of the maps. Now there's probably more detailed maps that different people have done for their theses, where they studying agriculture and land formations. But if you actually go to the Page and Things website and scroll through those maps, you'll see some of them show a lot more of the elevations and vegetation than others, especially some of the ones in the I think in the 1800s. There's a few of them on there that actually show some of that.
Thank you. Andrew Simpson is telling us that Diamond Valley is still there. So we have a question from Marcia Nurse. She wants to know, Jim, what year, and so approximately in what year did you discover your first bloodline Webster in Barbados?
when did I discover them, or when did they go back? I mean, I guess the first time I discovered them, so my dad never talked an awful lot about where he'd grown up and his time in Barbados. He was kind of more about the present. And when I came to Barbados in school, I was still in school in 1967, I arrived in Barbados expecting to meet my aunt, and all of a sudden I'm discovering all these Websters and all these other cousins that I never knew about. And then I remember at the time what I did was I went to the phone book, and I pulled out the Barbados phone book, and I looked in there. I said, man, if these Websters went back 300 years, the phone book must be filled with hundreds of these Websters. And so I was thinking, well, maybe I'll phone some. So when I opened up the phone book, there wasn't that as many as I thought there would be. So I think it showed that a lot of them over the centuries had left the island, and probably for better opportunities and things like that. So for me, the first time I really discovered I had an extended family was in 1967. And then again, about 13, 14 years ago, when I discovered that I had a much more extensive family in Barbados, and now I have that I've been connecting with, and now I have relatives and friends all over the world. It's been a great experience for me. It's been really enjoyable.
Okay, we have a question. This is a general question from Gerard Williams, who has been researching his Yearwood family from St. Lucie, his father's family. And he's wondering if there's anyone in the chat who has any information on that family. What I can say, if anyone in the chat does, they can email me at library@barbnews.org.bb. Mr. Williams, you can also send me your email address, and I will try to connect you. And did you come across any Yearwoods, Jim?
No.
Okay, there's another one. People in Barbados are fond of nicknames. Did you always know legal names, or did you have to find them?
I'm trying to think of.
This person also wants you to know from the Clark group that the maternal grandfather was a Webster who went by the name of Johnny.
Okay.
A name, of course.
Yes, Johnny. I think Johnny Webster is my grandfather's brother's son. And I believe he owned a shop at Rock Hall, and that was there for many years. And yeah, good.
Okay.
And there was another Johnny Webster that was, I believe he was supposed to be a very good shooter, and there was they used to have these ponds where they used to go hunting, and one day he was taking his gun, and he was going to walk some long distance to go to the shooting competition, and somebody said, well, aren't you going to take a horse and ride over there? It's a long way to go. He says, no, the prize for the competition is a horse, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to win. And when he came home at the end of the day, he was riding the horse. So so there's.
He was very sure of his talent. Okay,
Yeah.
we have quite a few questions in the chat, but we've been going for quite a while, and we cannot keep Jim much longer. What we've asked you is to send your questions. If we haven't answered them, send them to my email address, which will be put in the chat, library@barbnews.org.bb. Put your email as well, and we will try to connect you if it's a question for Jim, with Jim. If it's a general question, I will try to answer you. We apologize, and we are very happy for the enthusiastic response and the participation but we can only stay online long.
I really appreciate everybody's interest, and it's great to. I think I have a lot of family out there that probably maybe they're making up a percentage of this audience, but I can't see you, but I'm glad that we could connect, and I hope to hear from some of you soon.
Okay, I will answer Becky, the last one. She was asking about any books on enslaved people who eventually went into business. I can tell her that in our journal, there are a number of articles on Amaryllis Collymore, who would have been an enslaved person who owned plantations. London, for some reason his name is escaping me now. And Rachel. So we have Joseph Rachel, and so there's several articles in our journal which look at enslaved persons who eventually went into own property and so on. So perhaps you can email me as well that I can give you some more specifics. So I think we will end at that. Oh, Jim?
I just want to say I see he's online here, and I want to say special thanks to Freddie Aline, who, if he hadn't taken me on that little trip to the archives, I would have missed out on learning so much information. So thanks, Freddie. It's great to see you here today.
Fred, do you want to say something? We can unmute you. Freddie Aline.
Hi, Jim. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, good. I'm glad
Yes.
you came in.
Yeah, it's a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. So we'll soon have to produce a book, The Other Websters.
Yeah, the extended family version.
Yes. Well, you take care and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, if we could get over COVID, we could start traveling again. Okay, thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Fred.
Okay, bye-bye.
Jim, we want to thank you for an amazing session. We enjoyed it. The persons in the chat enjoyed it. For those persons who missed the beginning, we will edit the video and it will be uploaded to the museum's YouTube channel. You can also go to Facebook and you will still be able to access the recording, for a bit. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you very much again. And yes, I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. If you send those in to Harriet and they can get forwarded on to me, I'll help if I can.
Yes,
And now I can get some sleep because I don't have to worry about this presentation.
I also want to thank all of those in the chat. I think we had quite a few people in the chat. We had at one point, it was in excess of 120 or so. Oh, I was actually told that we, at one point, we were over 200 persons in the chat. And that is actually a first for us in the genealogy group. We usually have pretty good audiences, but we've never actually been reached the 200s. So thank you, Jim, for a very interesting presentation. Thank all the participants for staying the course with us. And we wish you all the best and stay safe in this COVID environment. We will let you know the time of our next presentation. Thank you all and be safe. Good evening.
Bye, everybody.